Hi, this is Dr. Patillo, and I am making a recording of the mini lecture on sexuality, inequality, and privilege for our class today, day 1 of week 6. First, I want to start by again saying thank you for your patience as I'm navigating this family emergency. I am actually recording this the night before I get on a plane so that I can get to Flagstaff, which has been a little delayed because of weather. But I should see you all on Thursday, and I just wanted to make sure that you knew that. So these are the key terms that show up in this chapter thus far. And I'm not going to necessarily go into definitions of each of them because these are all concepts that we have. Now, I know that we've talked about before the ways that repression during the Victorian era actually wasn't as repressed as we might consider because there needed to be conversation around sexual behaviors. But there was also a desire to really engage in understanding how to conduct oneself in public as the earning potential and income potential of people increased. So there was this desire for a particular kind of self-control that, for instance, during the Victorian era became personified or took on human form as a character culturally and socially known as Mrs. Grundy, who started basically as an offstage character in Thomas Morton's 1798 play, Speed the Plow. And in that play, characters fretted about what the very traditional and conservative Mrs. Grundy would think of their actions. So over time, this character's name became a social shorthand for respectable repression and extreme purity. And her name was invoked as a means of controlling and to a certain extent policing socially these desires that seemed out of control. So yes, women got the brunt of that. People perceived as women received the brunt of that. But this was not just something that was socially controlled in terms of feminine identity. It was also a desire to do this for masculine folks. So the thought was if folks understood as men, weren't consumed by sexual desires, they'd have more time to focus on being productive members of society. And so from this came these anti-masturbation devices that essentially, if you see some of them, they're intended to prevent men from engaging in any kind of intentional or even accidental self-pleasure. And particularly were encouraged to be worn at night such that the teeth of a ring would dig into any spontaneous erections, waking the person wearing it, as well as encouraging them to compose themselves instead of completing any kind of nocturnal emission. So from this, or maybe as a part of this, I should say, during these Victorian times and a focus on germs and the impact of germs, there was also this idea that masturbation or any kind of self-pleasure might cause insanity. That's where we get the idea that existed for a long time that masturbation would create blindness. But in addition, any kind of physical difference, such as being unhealthily skinny or being overweight or too pale or something like that, would brand you a likely chronic masturbator. And one of the impacts of that, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but to the top left of your screen is an image of two feminine appearing people in an embrace. Part of what was going on in this era was sort of a fascination with intimacy and desire on a different level, such that gender did not stop people from engaging in these physical and intimate ways. And things like below that couple is a couple in the bedroom. And the idea during that time was that unless a couple climaxed at the same time, that this would be considered a failed copulation. And in fact, people perceived as women were justified socially in outright refusing to engage in sexual behavior if they and their husbands couldn't achieve the, quote, orgasm of the woman and the ejaculation of the semen of the man at the same instance. So this persisted well into the 20th century, appearing in books about marriage right up to the time of Kinsey. And you also found that there was kind of during this time of fascination with the arts and expression of alternative understandings of how one presents gender, as well as how one engages in what we now describe as sex work. So it's the idea of this purity really ties into thinking about freedom and sexual politics in a very different way, and thinking about how we do sexual behavior and the ways that that's controlled. In this case, in this chapter, your book talks about it as being a part of a social reproduction frame. Now, this frame is useful for creating sexual liberation politics. Sexuality politics can't only focus on these formal freedoms in relation to state and federal laws, but they also need to look at how sexual liberation is impacted by power, status, class, and access to resources. So genuine sexual liberation requires that we move beyond formal equality rights towards a transformative challenge to the differential regimes of dispossession of our very bodies, our very desires and pleasures. And that's necessary because this dispossession undermines our control over our bodies and our lives. So when we think about this, it's important to think about the ways that sexual identity is impacted by laws, by politics, capitalist markets, class, access to basic material resources. And this is key, right? So Paul Reynolds in 2018, as recently as 2018, coined the term sexuality capitalism to describe from sort of a Marxist perspective and theoretical application, to describe sexual politics, culture, and economy in the current century. An analysis of how the emergence of gay and lesbian identities is linked with capitalism is one way to explore sexuality capitalism, but not the only one. John D'Amelio in 1993 argued that gay men and lesbians emerged in a particular historical era in conjunction with capitalism. So you often find in this conversation that while, as I just said, you don't necessarily need to focus just on the experiences of gay men and lesbians, it is particularly helpful to think about the ways that these perceived identities based on sexual behaviors and the partners that people sex with really become a focus and become policed by society, hoping to rein in identity and sexual behaviors in a particular way and for particular purposes. D'Amelio specifically linked the emergence of these identities to the free labor system associated with capitalism. The expansion of capitalism and the free labor system, he argued, had a profound effect on the structure and function of the nuclear family, ideologies surrounding family life, and the meaning of heterosexual relations. These changes were directly linked to the appearance of the collective gay life and the emergence of a gay identity at a particular socio-historical moment. Specifically, he claimed, quote, "Capitalism has created conditions that allow some men and some women to organize a personal life around their erotic, emotional attraction to their own sex. It has made possible the formation of urban communities of lesbians and gay men." And I would also argue that part of this allowed for people to organize themselves and think about themselves in terms of this erotic, emotional attraction as opposed to identity as a particular kind of laborer or among a particular social and economic class. So sexuality capitalism is also analyzed through Marx's concept of commodity fetishism. I'm going to say this wrong, I always do. Fetishism, sorry, commodity fetishism, or the process whereby people come to see objects as having these pseudo-supernatural attributes separate from and fully erased from the labor and social productions required to create it. So what does this kind of fetishism do? It plays out in the sphere of sexuality through the the commodification of sexuality and bodies and the projection of sexuality onto products and objects. So to think about this, you have someone like Haig's analysis of the aesthetics of commodities in late capitalism. And in 1986, Haig was talking about these aesthetics of commodities and how they become eroticized objects that mold and restructure how we understand human sexuality. As a result, as he explains, how desire is then produced through the sexualization of commodities, of these things, as they appeal to appetites and needs. So one way, I know that was sort of very theory heavy, but let's have an example. Deborah Curtis used this idea in 2004 to examine the link between the production of sexual subjectivity or sexual authority and being able to operate as a being with agency around one's sexual behavior. That's what she means by sexual subjectivity. So she analyzed the link between the production of this authority and agency and commodity consumption, thinking about these Tupperware-style sex toy parties. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was kind of this revolution in thinking about the use, the production, the marketing, and the experience of sex toys and sort of bringing it out of this subculture, underground, dark space into sort of a more openly, outright, playful approach. It's the kind of thing that, for instance, Sam Smith and Kim Petras are doing with some of with their recent song, I think it's Unholy is the title of it, as well as some of the work that Sam Smith is doing with their sort of campy look at sexuality. That all kind of, I believe, on a certain level, pays homage to these Tupperware-style sex toy parties. Places like, I believe it was the West Coast and New York, on either coast in the U.S., you had companies spring up like Toys in Babeland that were very much so campy, in your face, and very sex positive and pro sexual play in a different way. Curtis showed how these home-based parties organized by women and LGBTQ folks for women and LGBTQ folks to market sex toys incited consumer desires and as a result reshaped sexual practices. As Curtis explains it, how the product distributor would give these 1-hour demonstration of toys, explaining the ways they could be used, how to maintain them, how to clean them, and engage with them, and then allow people at the party to sort of touch and hold them in this way that was fun and playful and somewhat titillating and erotic, as opposed to penalizing and demonizing. These demonstrations generated sexual scripts that promoted diverse sexual activities, some of which many of the guests at these parties might not have ever imagined otherwise. Curtis explained how the guests, at least in her study, were motivated by the pleasure they derived from these, quote, self-illusionary experiences, where they got to think of themselves sexually and have the illusion of themselves as sexually different. And from this, the guests at these parties would associate these illusions of who they could and maybe should or would be sexually speaking with these particular products. So in this way, imagination, consumption, and sexual subjectivity or agency created new sexual possibilities. Curtis suggested that these Tupperware-style toy parties offer contradictory options as well. On one hand, in some ways, they enforced conformity to dominant sexual scripts because part of what they were doing was engaging, even if they were resisting some of the things, socially speaking, about the ways we thought about these sex toys, they also conformed to the notion that this was the paradigm we were working in by pushing against it. And then on the other hand, and for other people sometimes, these kinds of parties offered a sexual freedom and exploration that maybe they did not have the opportunity to engage in previously. And it just doesn't end with this expanded idea of sexual identity and how that operates. As recently as 2020, the Supreme Court is having this conversation as well. So part of what the Supreme Court does is when there are cases that are allowed to come before it that either address or specifically contain issues that are attached to a particular precedent, they combine them and listen to those cases all together. In 2020, 3 cases were brought together that led to what was a pretty big deal, a landmark decision protecting the workplace rights of LGBTQ Americans. And they involved these 3 cases: Gerald Bostock, Donald Zarda, and Amy Stevens. These 3 folk. So in the case of Bostock v. Clayton County, Georgia, Bostock identifies as a gay man, and he worked for the juvenile court of Clayton County in Georgia. And outside of work, he led a full life and was a part of a recreational softball league that identified as gay. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is the conversation wasn't about actual sexual behavior. He was involved in this league that was a team. However, the label, the social identity as gay, basically put him under fire. He was criticized for participating in this out of work on his free time activity, and eventually was fired for conduct, quote, unbecoming of a county employee. Bostock sued the county. He sued Clayton County, claiming he was fired because he was gay, that was the, quote, unbecoming conduct. And the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia dismissed the complaint, but his appeal was upheld. Now, below to the right, you see an image of the Supreme Court justices at the time, and you can see where the votes fell. Part of what happens in a court case is you are considering a particular question, which allows you to also think about what part of the Constitution might be violated or not. I cannot remember if I've said it before in this class. I believe I might have. That the sole task of the Supreme Court is to consider policies, legislation, ideas, anything that has to do with the law that may violate the basic principles of the Constitution. Part of what that means is that the 12 people that are currently on the court are reading, hearing about cases, going back, reading the Constitution, reading previous decisions related to particular sections of the Constitution, and then interpreting this more than 500-year document for contemporary times. The question here is, does Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits against employment discrimination, quote, because of sex, encompass discrimination based on an individual's sexual orientation? The second case that was tied into this package had to do with Donald Zardia, who, as a gay man, was a diving instructor, and in a moment of sort of trying to comfort a client who identified as a woman about his working with her in skydiving, where he basically had to be behind her and kind of tethered to her in the air, he kind of flippantly said, "Don't worry about it, I'm gay." And she complained, Zardia was fired, which he believed was because of his sexuality. He sued, but that District Court of New York rejected his claim. Then he appealed, and the initial ruling was overturned. So there was another appeal. The question in this case is pretty much the same. So that's part of why it became part of the package. Now, the third case with Amy Stevens, specifically Harris Funeral Homes versus the EEOC, or Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, who filed this case jointly with Amy Stevens, was about transitioning gender on the job. When Ms. Stevens came out at work and then engaged in the process, there were some unhappy people and another firing occurred. The question here is a little bit different, but not completely. Does Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibit discrimination against transgender employees based on 1, their status as transgender, or 2, sex stereotyping under Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins, which is another Supreme Court case that lawyers were arguing to build this case on. Decided on June 15th in 2020, the Supreme Court did something that many people found surprising, which was sided with LGBTQ workers and saying that firing them because of their sexuality did in fact violate this title of the Civil Rights Act. And it was 6-3 in favor of this. That's a pretty large margin for the Supreme Court. So when we think about this and consider things like sociology and the law or socio-legal work, some of the people we're thinking about are these 3 gentlemen. I've already talked a little bit about the guy with the bushy beard on the left, Karl Marx, but I just want to do a little bit more of a deep dive to make sure that you understand some details about sexual capitalism. So while Marx did not directly discuss the role of sexuality in capitalism, a lot of theorists have done what I call an aggressive read, where they, without the theorist being present, they take some of these ideas and put them in different contexts to better understand and engage them. So while he wasn't necessarily shouting about sexuality capitalism, many after him made the connections around this, using his foundational theories and methods. In sexuality studies, numerous scholars engage and extend a Marxist analysis through the body of the intersection of economy, history, politics, class, and sexuality. Frederick Engels, he and Marx considered Lewis Henry Morgan's historical materialist analysis of the family, and when they considered it and thought through it, they had some ideas. Morgan's book was one of the earliest texts to describe the division of labor within the nuclear bourgeoisie family as a form of control, and specifically control over women's sexuality and a source of oppression of women. So Engels describes Morgan's observation of the Iroquois nation in upstate New York as having kinship relations that differed greatly from Euro-Western concepts of kinship, family, gender, and sexuality, such as greater equality between the sexes and acceptance of diverse sexual practices. This all, for many folks, ties back to Marx. Feminists came to define social reproduction theory as an exploration of how the generational reproduction of human life, including and not limited to household labor and family relations. So these feminists came to define and understand social reproduction theory as essential to the workings of patriarchy and capitalism. This approach opens up new ways of understanding class, reproduction, and they include paid and unpaid labor and the gendered, racialized, and sexualized divisions of labor. Sexuality is constructed in relation to both social reproduction and labor. Sexuality and reproduction are constructed through labor, through the medium of the body, because labor creates particular embodied practices and experiences. And between them, you have W.E.B. Du Bois, who engaged Black women theorists like Anna Julia Cooper and Ida B. Wells Barnett, as well as LGBTQ thinkers such as Countee Cullen, who was a part of the Harlem Renaissance. And for some time, at least a little bit of time, Du Bois's son-in-law. So Du Bois was doing this, engaging Black women theorists and LGBTQ thinkers and theorists during a particularly troubled time, but he was noble in his approach to doing this work. So the other thing to know about these guys on this very text-heavy slide is to really think about how they are talking about a lived experience through their social categories of analysis here, okay? So if you think about it this way, Marx was a classical social theorist, and he focused on class inequities, specifically during the 19th century. Marx was critical of industrial capitalism, particularly for its exploitation of workers. He theorized that workers would unite and overthrow capitalism in the face of this kind of exploitation. And he described the class conflict as the engine of history, the thing that moved us forward. And our text talks about this a fair amount in thinking about how class impacts sexual behavior and the perception of sexual identity based on the perception of sexual behavior in chapter 4, the previous chapter. Then you have the German social theorist Max Weber, who's often described as arguing with the ghost of Marx, so to speak. Weber suggested that we broaden our understanding of inequity and inequality beyond social class to include status inequities as well. So he leaned on the work of Marx to expand that and use that, thinking aggressively about what was being shared. The class system operates on a hierarchy with the upper classes at the top and the poor at the bottom, and it shows up in these particular ways. Conflict. So then thinking through these social inequities or these patterns, specific patterns of unequal distribution of goods and resources along group or category or identity lines, like and then thinking about the way that feeds that into and informs an institutionalized inequity and status inequalities. So it's because of that, we have things to then like remember that social hierarchies are not institutionalized inequity, but we have status intersect and related to and with each other constantly. Economic position. Thus, power and inequality are intricately connected to our understandings of gender, sex, and sexual behavior, i.e., sexuality. So the person that you see here, Gail Rubin, is a really important name in sociology and particularly in feminist sociology and queer sociology and the sociology of sexuality. Dr. Rubin, in her 1984 essay, Thinking Sex, is widely regarded as a founding theorist of gay and lesbian studies, sexuality studies, and queer theory. And part of why is because her contribution of thinking through the sex-gender system as a set of arrangements that turn biological sex or understandings of biological sex into products of human activity, resulting in oppression. So Rubin is interested in the psychosocial origins of sexist and heterosexual oppression. And while Rubin suggests that sexism and heterosexism are not inevitable, they are, she suggests, the result of specific social organization and are thus deeply entrenched hierarchies. Throughout most of the world, gender is organized in a hierarchy. Men and masculinity and all things read and considered as such are valued more than women and femininity and all things considered as such. This form of inequality shapes the way gender roles are constructed. So those with more power, traditionally men, became defined as more powerful. So in her text, Rubin documents the existence of a patriarchy where women experience sexism and inequality, a racial hierarchy in which racial minorities face systemic disadvantage and systematic disadvantage, and where poor people face disadvantage in relation to the wealthy. And it didn't just end with Dr. Rubin. The primary hierarchy under investigation in this particular text is the sexuality hierarchy, a status hierarchy in which LGBTQ people face discrimination and inequality, while individuals identifying as or just perceived as straight or heterosexual benefit from heterosexual privilege. The unearned benefits and access to resources associated with the presumption that one is heterosexual. While we may be more familiar with the language associated with the gender hierarchy, for instance, i.e. the patriarchy, the sexuality status hierarchy is referred to as heteroarchy, the system of straight over gay domination. And how does heteroarchy perpetuate itself? Well, here's how. So I feel like you had to know this was coming. It perpetuates itself through social institutions. So just a super quick recap, because I want to make sure we all understand how this operates in terms of social reproduction as well as cultural production in many ways. A social institution is a network or organized pattern of social relationships and actions and interactions which are relatively permanent and come into existence to fulfill social needs or to satisfy basic human needs. Therefore, these institutions can be seen as an indispensable part of the large society or community. In other words, social institutions are complex sets of statuses, roles, organizations, norms, and beliefs that meet people's basic needs within society. Institutions, or the term institution, refers to the organized way of doing things and is used here in this context to represent commonly taught and understood procedures. Horton and Hunt define social institutions as, quote, systems of norms which achieve some goal or activity that people feel is important, end quote. More formally, you can think of them as an organized cluster of what some disciplines might call folkways or pathways, lifeways, and mores centered around a major human activity. Durkheim went to the extent of defining sociology as the science of social institutions, and Giddings regards institutions as the organs that conserve what is to be considered the best in the past of the human race. And I would also add that my reading of Giddings is that it's conserving the best of the past, but also providing a process and a way forward such that the best, or what is thought of as the best, is reproduced over and over again. So institutions are structured processes through which people carry out their activities. To fulfill their self-interest, people form different types of associations. And by this, I mean the sociological understanding of associations. These organizations and associations have their own working, practiced methods or procedures to satisfy or achieve their goals. To fulfill different interests and objectives, people in positions of power use these rules, systems, methods, and/or procedures to maintain progress towards those goals, which you can think of as the status quo. Therefore, institutions are useful social tools to meet specific needs. An example is if we see, for instance, NAU campus as a collection of different types of folks. So a collection of campus administrators and campus professors and lecturers and other staff. Then the campus is an organization or association with objectives. To fulfill those objectives, any campus, not just NAU, develops a specific method to meet those goals of education. And to do so, it prepares timetables and rules and regulations and adopts an examination system. These things all make the campus an institution, part of the institution of education. So if you're looking for a definition, because I know that was a lot of sort of theoretical context, you could use Weber, right? Who has defined the social institution as the social relations in a whole network of social actions. According to Schaeffer, social institutions are organized patterns of beliefs and behaviors centered on basic social needs. And according to our friends Harton and Hunt, an institution is an organized system of social relationships which embodies certain common values and procedures and meets certain needs of the society. According to Borgatus, a social institution is a structure that is organized to meet the needs of people chiefly through well-established procedures. And by this, he meant that institutions exist only so far as people act in certain ways. The institution is manifested only as a pattern of behavior. So, for example, marriage, kinship, family, religion, economy, polity, or politics are social institutions because they are networks of social relationships and social actions. Okay? So what does this mean for us in terms of thinking about sexuality? Well, there are several areas where we can examine this in a little bit more detail. In terms of marriage equality, there's state-recognized unions that bring about economic privileges, the ability to make medical decisions for one another, greater options in terms of family expansion and or adoption, greater options in terms of thinking about citizenship status, how that happens and who gets access to that. The issues include, one, that there are other more salient to day-to-day lives ways that relationships are legitimated, and that the current use of these state-recognized unions embraces an inherently unequal patriarchal institution that requires a particular kind of normalizing or selling out, if you will. And as I just said, it's really selective legitimacy that these offer. In terms of adoption, as recently as 2006, 7 states prohibited LGBTQ adoption. Those states are Nebraska, Missouri, Florida, Michigan, Oklahoma, Utah, and Mississippi. And after 2016, there was implemented a new rule that allows adoption and foster care agencies receiving public funds to turn away LGBTQ care providers. And there's also just the everyday challenges around some of the same things about marriage equality in terms of being an adoptive second parent, being able to make medical decisions, to be legitimately seen and respected as a parent, as it were. In terms of military service, though not true with race, the military has been slower to make changes than the civilian world when it comes to issues related to gender and sexual behavior. And for any of you interested in thesis or dissertation work, this would be a fascinating project, I believe, to take on and examine. At the end of World War II, the United States immediately entered the Cold War, and homosexuals, or people who were understood as gay or LGBTQ, as we might refer to them now, were deemed, quote-unquote, unfit to serve. Don't Ask, Don't Tell legislation took effect in the 1990s, and President Obama ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2011. Thus, for the first time since 1940, gay and lesbian service members were free to serve their country openly and without discrimination. And there's evidence that lesbians serving in the military are victimized by sexual harassment because they are women and by homophobia due to being lesbians. And sometimes the harassment they face is due to an intersection of sexism and homophobia. For example, one type of sexual harassment military women face has been the accusation that they are lesbian if they are unwilling to have sex with their male comrades. So it's not even necessarily about an identity in that way. It's harassment based on who someone is not interested in sexing with, and making an assumption about that being a static, unmovable, unchangeable thing, and not even a maybe she doesn't like me kind of question, right? The military declared transgender individuals unfit to serve and banned them in the 1970s. However, that is changing. Prior to 2015, if an active member of the military began to transition, they faced a dishonorable discharge. However, as of June 2015, the Pentagon began the process of ending the ban on transgender service members, expecting this process to last 6 months. A welcome change to the 15,000 transgender military personnel that we know of currently serving their country. This ended under the Trump administration when Trump reinstated the ban on trans military service members, which went into effect in March 2018. Courts originally blocked his order, but the administration won on appeal. The ban prohibits transgender people from enlisting and prohibits current military personnel from transitioning. There's also the issue of employment. The legal protection women and people of color currently have under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and various other federal equal employment opportunity laws, or EEOC laws, from being discriminated against in the workplace due to their sex or their race, is not shared by LGBTQ employees. And it's worthwhile to point out that even in the discussion around overturning Roe v. Wade a few months ago now, there's still conversation about how this is attached to Title VII and the broad-reaching implications of sort of undermining the strength of that particular title. This is where you see that, or one of the places where you see that show up. Some other ideas to consider. Let's start with sociologist Simon and Gagnon, who in 1967 argued that there are three broad types of sexual deviancy. We can also think about criminalization. The first law outlawing male sodomy was known as the Buggery Act, passed in England in 1533. We talked about that in our conversation around Oscar Wilde. At the time, male sodomy was considered both a sin and a crime. The original 13 U.S. colonies took their laws from English common law, including the criminalization of sodomy, which was punishable by death. The Puritans considered sodomy to be the most serious sexual sin. Originally, sodomy laws targeted particular sexual behaviors, such as same-gender sexual behaviors between men, rather than particular people, i.e., gay men or homosexuals. As law moved away from religion, sodomy remained a crime, but penalties for violating the law lessened. As of 1960, every state had anti-sodomy laws, despite the fact that such laws punished adult, consenting, private sexual behaviors. In 1961, the Illinois legislature revised their criminal code without criminalizing sodomy, and it went unnoticed. U.S. sodomy laws were overturned by the Supreme Court case Lawrence v. Texas in 2003. This decision overturned remaining sodomy laws in Texas and 13 other states, making same-sex or same-gender sexual behaviors legal throughout the U.S. This included reversing the court's previous Bowers v. Hardwick 1985 decision. In the Bowers case, the defendant was arrested for engaging in oral sex in his own home. Yet the court ruled that long-standing apathy toward homosexual sex was enough reason to deny a defendant a right to sodomy. In overturning the Bowers case, the court decided in Lawrence v. Texas that a homosexual's private, consensual sexual practices were protected. And I would add, by that, that also means regardless of who you sex with, your private consensual sexual practices are protected. There's also medicalization. Homosexuality was first included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSMD, in 1952 as a sociopathic personality disorder, in which these folks were argued to have a pathological fear of the opposite sex. The 1950s promoted an extreme culture of conformity. The Cold War was a particularly difficult period for gays and lesbians. Senator Joseph McCarthy included gays and lesbians in his communist witch hunts, declaring them weak and thus susceptible to communist infiltrators. During this period, many LGBTQ individuals were institutionalized in mental institutions to cure them of their homosexuality. So I want you to keep this in mind as we move forward, not this week, but next week. One of the films that we'll see either next week or the week after is Circus of Books. And some of these same issues come up and crop up in interesting ways, as well as the concepts that are present in the chapter that this film is more directly connected to. Thank you for sitting through and listening through the lecture. Feel free to stop, go back. It's the beauty of a recorded lecture as you need be. And I will see you on Thursday.